School bullies laughs at the new transfer's cheap clothes, until they learn who his parents are. The sleek black sedan looked out of place against Ridgeway Academy's ostentatious parking lot filled with gleaming sports cars and luxury vehicles. As it rolled to a stop, the driver, a man in a simple gray uniform, stepped out and opened the rear door. Lucas Carter emerged, squinting against the morning sunlight. Unlike the chauffeur-driven students stepping out of their Bentleys and Porsches, Lucas thanked his driver with a genuine smile and a handshake. Anyone watching might have mistaken the man for Lucas's father rather than an employee. "You sure about this, Lucas?" the driver asked, concern etching his weathered face. "Your parents would understand if you changed your mind." Lucas adjusted the strap of his worn-out backpack, the same one he'd used for the past 3 years, and shook his head. "I'm sure, Carl. This is something I need to do." As the sedan pulled away, Lucas turned to face the imposing Gothic architecture of Ridgeway Academy. The prestigious private school stood like a fortress of privilege against the clear blue sky, its ancient stone walls housing the children of tech moguls, Wall Street executives, and old money families. Annual tuition exceeded the average American's yearly salary, a fact the school's brochures subtly boasted about between glossy images of ivy-covered walls and students in perfectly pressed uniforms. Lucas took a deep breath and headed through the wrought iron gates. Inside the administrative office, the secretary's smile faltered as she looked up from her computer. Her eyes performed the familiar assessment Lucas had grown accustomed to: worn jeans, clean but frayed at the hems, a simple blue button-up shirt, no visible designer logo, and scuffed sneakers that had clearly seen better days. "Lucas Carter?" she asked, a hint of disbelief in her voice as she consulted her screen. "For the mid-semester transfer?" "That's me," Lucas replied, his voice quiet but confident. The secretary's perfectly manicured fingers tapped a few keys. "That's unusual. We rarely accept transfers mid-semester." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Your paperwork must be quite compelling." Lucas merely shrugged, offering no explanation. After being issued his schedule and a map of the sprawling campus, Lucas made his way to his first class, Advanced Economics with Professor Harrington. He slipped through the door just as the bell rang, feeling 26 pairs of curious eyes immediately lock onto him. 26 students dressed identically in Ridgeway's formal uniform, yet each accessorized with subtle displays of wealth: designer watches, custom leather bags, and the latest tech gadgets. Professor Harrington, a stern man with salt and pepper hair and gold-rimmed glasses, paused his lecture. "Ah, you must be our new addition. Mr. Carter, is it?" Lucas nodded, clutching his second-hand textbook, purchased online at a fraction of the campus bookstore's price. "Well, don't just stand there. Introduce yourself to your classmates." Lucas turned to face the room, his expression neutral. "I'm Lucas. Just transferred from Westlake Public." He said nothing more, ignoring the widening eyes and whispers that erupted at the mention of a public school. "Public school?" The whisper that wasn't really a whisper came from the back of the room. A boy with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smirk that suggested he'd never heard the word "no" in his life leaned forward. "Did the scholarship office make a clerical error?" Several students snickered, but Professor Harrington silenced them with a glare. "Mr. Whitmore, that's quite enough. Mr. Carter, please take the empty seat beside Ms. Reynolds." Lucas made his way to the indicated desk next to a girl with chestnut hair who, unlike her classmates, wasn't staring at him with either contempt or morbid curiosity. Instead, she offered a small, apologetic smile. "Hi," she whispered as Lucas sat down. "I'm Emma. Nice to meet you," Lucas replied, then focused his attention on Professor Harrington's lecture, meticulously taking notes, while ignoring the occasional paper ball that landed on his desk. As the day progressed, Lucas navigated Ridgeway's unwritten social code. In the hallways, students parted like the Red Sea around Henry Whitmore, the blonde boy from economics, and his entourage of equally privileged friends. They commanded attention, laughing loudly and carelessly bumping into anyone they deemed beneath them. A month into his time at Ridgeway, Lucas had settled into a routine of quiet excellence and stoic endurance. While Henry's taunts continued, something else had begun to unsettle the established hierarchy: Lucas's academic performance. "Mr. Carter," Professor Harrington called out, handing back their economics exams. "Exceptional work. The highest score I've seen in 15 years of teaching." The classroom fell silent. Henry's jaw tightened as he glanced down at his own B-. For generations, Whitmore males had dominated Ridgway's academic rankings, a tradition Henry's father reminded him of at every family dinner. After class, Emma caught up with Lucas in the hallway. "That was amazing! I studied all weekend and barely managed an A-. Economics is intuitive once you understand the principles," Lucas replied, slipping his perfect paper into his worn backpack without ceremony. "You could tutor some of us," Emma suggested. "People would pay well." A shoulder slammed into Lucas, sending him against the lockers. Henry smirked as he passed, his friends snickering behind him. "Sorry, didn't see you there, poor boy. Maybe if you wore something besides thrift store garbage, you'd be more visible." Lucas straightened, brushed himself off, and continued walking as if nothing had happened. "How do you do that?" Emma asked, hurrying after him. "Just let it go. Getting angry would only give him what he wants," Lucas answered simply. "Well, your patience is about to be tested," Emma said, pointing to a flyer on the bulletin board. "Debate club meets today. Henry's the president." Lucas studied the notice. "Interesting topic. Whether generational wealth is a societal benefit or detriment. You're not actually thinking of going?" Lucas smiled, the first genuine smile Emma had seen from him. "Wouldn't miss it." The debate room buzzed with conversation as students took their seats. Henry held court at the front, his custom-tailored blazer adorned with the silver debate team pin reserved for the club president. When Lucas walked in, the room quieted. Henry's eyes narrowed. "Lost Carter? The financial aid office is in the East Wing. I'm here for the debate," Lucas replied, taking an empty seat in the back row. Professor Wallace, the faculty advisor, clapped his hands. "Excellent! New perspectives are always welcome. Now, Mr. Whitmore will argue that generational wealth benefits society through philanthropic endeavors and economic stability. Who would like to take the opposing position?" The room remained silent. Arguing against wealth at Ridgway was like arguing against oxygen. "I will," Lucas said quietly. Henry's laugh was sharp. "This should be entertaining. What would you know about wealth? The rules state 5 minutes per opening argument," Professor Wallace reminded them. "Mr. Whitmore, you may begin." Henry delivered his argument with the polished confidence of someone who had been trained in public speaking since childhood. He cited philanthropic foundations, arts endowments, and university donations as evidence that concentrated wealth ultimately served the greater good. When Lucas's turn came, he stood without notes. His voice, normally soft, filled the room with unexpected authority. "Generational wealth," he began, "creates economic stagnation by concentrating resources among those who did nothing to earn them beyond selecting the correct parents. For every philanthropic gesture Mr. Whitmore cites, I can show you 10 tax havens, 15 instances of wage suppression, and 20 examples of environmental damage caused by the pursuit of profit over people." As Lucas continued, dismantling Henry's arguments with precise economic data and real-world examples, the room grew increasingly uncomfortable. These weren't abstract theories but pointed critiques that implicated many students' families. "And finally," Lucas concluded, "true philanthropy isn't giving away a fraction of excess wealth after exploiting systems designed to favor the privileged. It's building equitable systems that eliminate the need for charity altogether." The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Wallace cleared his throat. "Well, excellent points from both sides. Let's move to rebuttals." Henry's rebuttal was flustered and defensive. Lucas's was measured and devastating. When the debate concluded, even students from wealthy families were nodding thoughtfully at Lucas's arguments. "The audience will now vote on the more compelling position," Professor Wallace announced. Lucas won by a landslide. The next morning, Lucas found his locker plastered with pictures of homeless people and sarcastic notes, reading, "Your family?" and "Future Carter Residence." Inside, his books had been doused with water, the pages warped and illegible. Emma helped him clean up, her expression troubled. "This is escalating, Lucas. Henry can't stand being beaten at anything. Books can be replaced," Lucas said, carefully separating soggy pages. "It's not just about books," Emma hissed. "Don't you get it? The more you excel, the worse it's going to get." As if on cue, Henry and 3 of his friends surrounded them in the hallway. "Debate club was a fluke," Henry said, his voice dangerously low. "Know your place, scholarship case." Lucas met his gaze evenly. "And what place would that be?" "At the bottom, where you belong." Henry grabbed Lucas's backpack, tearing the already frayed strap. Its contents spilled across the floor: books, papers, and a simple brown paper lunch bag. Henry snatched the bag and held it high. "Let's see what poor boy brought for lunch today." Students gathered as Henry emptied the contents onto a desk. A basic turkey sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. "Look, everyone! While we're eating gourmet pasta, poor boy here is bringing elementary school lunches." Henry dramatically pinched his nose. "Probably made by his mommy, if she's not too busy cleaning houses." Emma stepped forward. "Leave him alone, Henry. Defending your charity project, Reynolds? Maybe you should donate your allowance to him instead of that designer purse you've been eyeing." Emma flushed with shame at the truth in his words. Through it all, Lucas remained silent, methodically picking up his scattered belongings. "What's wrong with you?" Henry finally demanded, frustrated by Lucas's lack of reaction. "Are you brain damaged or just too poor to afford a spine?" Lucas straightened, his calm gaze unwavering. "I simply recognize that your behavior says more about you than it ever could about me." The simple statement, delivered without anger, seemed to hit Henry harder than any insult could have. "The charity gala is this weekend." Henry recovered, his voice sharp. "My father's giving the keynote address. Maybe you can collect some spare change while serving the drinks." As Henry walked away, Emma helped Lucas with the last of his papers. "You need to stand up for yourself," she urged. Lucas watched Henry's retreating figure, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "The annual charity gala," he mused. "I'd almost forgotten. You're not actually thinking of going?" Emma asked incredulously. "It appears I don't have a choice," Lucas replied, showing her a note from the principal's office that had been among his papers. It was a personal invitation insisting on his attendance. "That's odd," Emma frowned. "They never make attendance mandatory." "Perhaps," Lucas said, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "They have their reasons." Ridgeway Academy's annual charity gala transformed the normally austere campus into a glittering showcase of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary scaffolding over the quad, while white-gloved servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more than most families' weekly grocery bills. The event was legendary among America's elite. Attendance was by invitation only, with minimum donations starting at 6 figures. For one night each year, the country's most powerful families gathered to network, broker deals, and ostensibly, support education for the less fortunate. Emma's family had attended for generations, though they were considered minor players in Ridgeway's social hierarchy. She found Lucas in the library the day before the gala, studying as if final exams weren't months away. "You're not seriously coming tomorrow, are you?" she asked, sliding into the chair across from him. Lucas looked up from his economics textbook. "The principal made it clear attendance was mandatory. For students whose parents are donors," Emma clarified. "Nobody expects scholarship students to attend." Lucas closed his book. "And yet I received this." He slid a heavy cream-colored envelope across the table. Emma's eyes widened as she recognized the gold-embossed invitation, not the standard student attendance notice, but the formal invitation sent to VIP guests. "There must be a mistake." "That's what I thought," Lucas replied, "until Principal Montgomery personally delivered it and insisted I attend." Emma handed back the invitation, her expression troubled. Henry's planning something. He's been whispering with his friends all week, looking at you and laughing. I suspected as much. Then why go? Why walk into whatever humiliation he's planning? Lucas carefully packed his books. Some invitations, Emma, are actually commands in disguise. She grabbed his arm. At least let me help you prepare. I could loan you one of my brother's old suits. That won't be necessary, Lucas said gently. But thank you. The night of the gala arrived with unseasonable warmth for October. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway as valets scurried to park Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and Maseratis. Students and parents mingled in formal attire that ranged from merely expensive to worth more than some homes. Henry Whitmore stood at the entrance with his parents, greeting arriving guests like royalty receiving subjects. His father, Richard Whitmore, was an imposing figure with steel-gray hair and the commanding presence of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. This year's donations will exceed last year's by 20%, Richard was telling a group of admiring parents. Once I finish my keynote, checkbooks will open even wider than usual. Henry nodded proudly, then froze as he spotted Emma arriving in a modest but elegant navy blue dress. Reynolds, he acknowledged with a nod, then smirked. Where's your charity project? Did he realize he couldn't afford the dress code? He'll be here, Emma replied, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. Inside, the school's great hall had been transformed into a ballroom. A string quartet played classical music while the elite of American society engaged in the true purpose of the evening, showing off their wealth while securing their children's futures through strategic connections. Henry gathered his inner circle, pointing out the business titans, tech visionaries, and old money patriarchs in attendance. My father's the keynote speaker this year, he boasted. The school board practically begged him. A hush fell over the entrance, pulling Henry's attention away from his admirers. He turned to see what had caused the sudden silence. Lucas Carter stood in the doorway. Gone was the boy in worn jeans and faded shirts. In his place stood a young man in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that made the expensive suits around him look mass-produced by comparison. The subtle details, hand-stitched lapels, platinum cufflinks, and a watch so understated yet valuable that only true connoisseurs would recognize its worth, spoke of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Lucas moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone born to such environments. People unconsciously stepped aside as he passed, responding to an authority they couldn't quite identify but instinctively respected. Who is that? Henry heard someone whisper. The new transfer student, came the reply. But I thought he was poor? Henry interjected, recovering from his shock. He is. That's just a rental. Probably maxed out a credit card to pretend he belongs here. Lucas approached their group, nodding politely to Henry and his friends. Good evening. Up close, it was evident that Lucas's transformation went beyond clothing. His posture, the way he held his champagne flute, even his accent seemed subtly different, more refined, as if he'd been restraining himself all along. Playing dress-up, Carter? Henry sneered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Simply dressing appropriately for the occasion, Lucas replied mildly. Principal Montgomery hurried over, his usual administrative composure replaced by almost fawning deference. Mr. Carter! So pleased you could attend. Your par. He caught himself, glancing nervously at the confused faces around them. The keynote presentation will begin shortly. Perhaps you'd like to take your seat at the front table? The front table? Henry echoed incredulously. That's reserved for major donors and board members. The principal smiled tightly. Indeed it is, Mr. Whitmore. As Lucas followed the principal, Emma caught up to him. What's going on, Lucas? A correction of misconceptions, he answered cryptically. The lights dimmed, directing attention to the podium. Richard Whitmore straightened his tie, preparing to take the stage as he'd done at countless such events. Instead, the principal stepped to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, faculty, and students, Ridgeway Academy is honored to welcome tonight's keynote speakers, whose generosity has transformed countless lives through education. Richard frowned, clearly caught off guard. "Please join me in welcoming Mr. James Carter and Mrs. Evelyn Carter." The crowd applauded politely, most guests exchanging confused glances. The Whitmores weren't the only ones blindsided. Even the board members looked surprised. Two elegantly dressed figures entered from a side door. The man was tall and distinguished with Lucas's same observant eyes, while the woman carried herself with graceful authority. As they took the stage, Lucas rose from his seat, a small smile playing at his lips. "We're delighted to finally visit Ridgeway in person," James Carter began, his voice resonating through the hall. "Our son Lucas has told us so much about his experiences here." As the words registered, hundreds of heads swiveled toward Lucas, then back to the stage, making the connection. Henry's face drained of color as the magnitude of his mistake dawned on him. The Carters weren't just wealthy donors. They were Lucas's parents. A murmur rippled through the crowd as James and Evelyn Carter took the stage. Recognition dawned on the faces of the business elite in attendance, not the polite acknowledgement reserved for wealthy peers, but the wide-eyed respect accorded to those who existed in a different stratosphere of influence. "For those unfamiliar with our work," James continued smoothly, "the Carter Foundation focuses on educational equality and opportunity." The understatement was almost comical. The Carter Foundation was a global powerhouse that had revolutionized access to education in 47 countries. Their annual philanthropic budget exceeded the GDP of several small nations. Evelyn Carter, elegant in a simple black gown adorned only with a single strand of pearls, stepped forward. "While we typically maintain a low profile, we felt it important to address the Ridgeway community personally tonight." In the audience, Lucas sat perfectly still as hundreds of eyes darted between him and his parents. Emma, beside him, looked as though she'd been struck by lightning. "You're those Carters?" she whispered. Lucas nodded slightly, his attention fixed on Henry, who stood frozen near his father. Richard Whitmore's complexion had taken on an unhealthy grayish tinge as he gripped the back of a chair for support. "Our foundation has silently funded Ridgeway Academy for over a decade," James revealed, causing another wave of whispers. "Including the scholarship program that supports 68 current students." Henry's friends, the same ones who had participated in Lucas's humiliation, squirmed uncomfortably as the implication became clear. Many of them were at Ridgeway because of Carter Foundation scholarships. Their families carefully maintained facades of wealth covering financial realities that were far more modest. Evelyn's voice grew more pointed. "We were curious about the social environment our son would encounter in such a prestigious institution. So we suggested an experiment." On the massive screen behind them appeared the social media posts mocking Lucas, his clothes, his lunch, his supposed poverty, all attributed to their creators. Henry's username featured prominently. Lucas agreed to attend Ridgeway without revealing his background. Evelyn continued. To experience the school not as the son of major benefactors, but simply as a student of modest means. The silence in the hall was absolute. "What we discovered," James said, his voice hardening, "was disappointing. A culture of elitism. Bullying tolerated because the perpetrators have influential parents. Values directly contrary to those this institution claims to uphold." Richard Whitmore finally found his voice. "Now see here," he began, stepping forward. "Kids will be kids. Surely we needn't dramatize typical teenage." "Ah, Richard," James interrupted, as if just noticing him. "I'm glad you brought that up. We've had some interesting conversations with your London investors regarding the Whitmore Fund's claimed returns versus actual performance." Richard went rigid, his protest dying in his throat. "But tonight isn't about business," James continued pleasantly. "It's about education, specifically, the education of our youth in values beyond wealth accumulation." Evelyn took over seamlessly. "The Carter Foundation is restructuring its relationship with Ridgeway Academy. Our continued support will depend on substantial changes to the school's culture." The board members looked stricken. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Without Carter funding, Ridgeway's endowment would collapse. "We'll be establishing a new Ethics and Inclusion Committee," Evelyn announced. And we've asked Emma Reynolds to serve as the student representative. Emma gasped as attention shifted to her. Miss Reynolds demonstrated moral courage when it wasn't advantageous, James explained. The kind of character that should be celebrated rather than penalized in our educational institutions. Lucas finally rose from his seat and joined his parents on stage. Standing between them, the family resemblance was unmistakable, not just in physical features, but in the quiet assurance with which they carried themselves. I'd like to speak briefly, Lucas said, addressing his peers directly. I came to Ridgeway not to expose or embarrass anyone, but to understand. To see if a place that produces so many of our world's future leaders truly prepares them for responsible leadership. His gaze found Henry, who looked away. What I found were students who've been taught that their worth comes from their family names and bank accounts rather than their character and contributions. Lucas paused. But I also found people capable of kindness without agenda, and that gives me hope. As Lucas stepped back, his mother took the microphone again. The true measure of privilege isn't how it elevates you above others, but how you use it to elevate everyone. Remember that your presence at Ridgeway isn't just an opportunity for you, but a responsibility to become the kind of people who make the world better, not just for people like yourselves, but for everyone. The remainder of the gala proceeded in a daze of shocked conversations and recalibrated social calculations. Parents who had earlier ignored Lucas now desperately attempted to introduce their daughters. Board members huddled in concerned groups. Students who had laughed at Henry's jokes suddenly couldn't remember his name. At the center of it all stood the Carter family, receiving a steady stream of well-wishers with gracious ease, including Richard Whitmore, who approached with forced cordiality. James, Evelyn. He nodded stiffly. Quite the dramatic reveal. We should discuss your concerns about Ridgeway privately. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding about Henry's high spirits. Oh, I don't think there's been any misunderstanding, Evelyn replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But we're always open to discussion. Perhaps over brunch tomorrow? I believe both our families have homes in the same Lake Tahoe community. Richard's smile faltered. The Whitmores had a vacation cottage in Tahoe, but the Carters owned half the shoreline. Henry, Lucas said quietly as Richard fumbled for a response. I believe you have something that belongs to me. He held out his hand. After a moment of confusion, understanding dawned on Henry's face. Slowly, he unpinned the silver debate team president badge from his lapel and placed it in Lucas's palm. We'll compete properly next time, Lucas said. The small exchange, witnessed by those nearby, was the final confirmation of a new order at Ridgeway Academy. Henry Whitmore's world collapsed over the weekend following the gala. By Monday morning, the school had transformed as drastically as if the buildings themselves had been renovated overnight. The change was invisible to the eye but palpable in the atmosphere, a fundamental shift in the social hierarchy that had governed Ridgeway for generations. Henry arrived in his usual fashion, climbing out of his luxury car with practiced nonchalance. But instead of the customary greetings and sycophantic smiles, he was met with silence. Former friends suddenly found their phones fascinating. Others whispered behind their hands as he passed. Henry! Brad Collins jogged up to him, his oldest friend and loyal lieutenant in tormenting Lucas. Dude, my dad is freaking out. He says your father's investment firm manages our family portfolio and... Not now, Henry snapped, scanning the courtyard. His usual path to the main entrance had mysteriously become congested with students who didn't move aside as they normally would. When he finally reached his locker, Henry found it stripped of the athletic trophies and team photos that had once adorned it. Instead, a single piece of paper was taped to the door, a printout of his own social media post mocking Lucas's lunch, with every username that had liked or commented highlighted. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore it down. They're all over the school, came a voice behind him. Henry turned to find Emma watching him with cool detachment. Enjoy your moment, he snarled. This doesn't change anything. It changes everything, Emma replied. The board already met in emergency session last night. New anti-bullying policies are being implemented immediately. So what? My father. Your father spent the weekend making frantic calls to investors. Emma cut in. My dad's on the board. He said Richard Whitmore is hemorrhaging clients after the Carters mentioned irregularities in his fund management. The blood drained from Henry's face. His father had been unusually subdued at breakfast, his typical bombastic confidence replaced by distracted worry. The president of the Parents Association is calling for your suspension, Emma continued. The same woman who invited you to her daughter's Sweet 16 last month. Before Henry could respond, a familiar figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Lucas Carter walked toward them, still dressed in his modest attire despite the previous night's revelation. Students parted before him like a wave, but not from intimidation. Their expressions showed something new, respect. Lucas nodded politely to each person who greeted him, making no distinction between those who had been kind to him and those who had joined in his torment. When he reached Henry and Emma, he stopped. Good morning, he said simply. Henry's instinct was to lash out, to reassert dominance, but the words died in his throat as he noticed several teachers watching closely from the doorways of their classrooms. Your family ruined my father, he managed instead, his voice a hoarse whisper. No, Henry, Lucas replied quietly. Your father made choices. My family merely brought those choices to light. As Lucas continued down the hall with Emma, Henry became aware of the absence at his sides. His entourage had evaporated. He stood alone, the prince without a court. In advanced economics, Professor Harrington announced a group project worth 30% of their final grade. I've assigned the teams, he said, consulting his clipboard. And as suggested by our new Educational Diversity Initiative, groups will include students from different socioeconomic perspectives. His eyes found Henry. Mr. Whitmore, you'll be working with Mr. Carter and Miss Reynolds. The universe, Henry decided, had a cruel sense of humor. During lunch, he approached their table with leaden feet, his previously boundless confidence evaporated. I don't need your charity, he muttered as he sat. Interesting choice of words, Lucas noted. Considering you once accused me of being a charity case. Emma opened her laptop. If we're going to work together, we need ground rules. I'm not interested in your rules. Henry snapped, then flinched as heads turned at nearby tables. His outburst had drawn attention, and the looks weren't sympathetic. Henry, Lucas said, leaning forward. This isn't punishment. It's an opportunity to demonstrate that you're more than the person who tormented someone because of their perceived financial status. Easy for you to say from your billionaire pedestal. Nothing about this was easy, Lucas countered. I spent months being humiliated for circumstances that weren't real, while you were celebrated for advantages you didn't earn. The raw truth of the statement left Henry without a retort. After school, he discovered his car boxed in by two others. As Henry searched for the owners, his phone buzzed with a notification. #enforced humility was trending at Ridgeway, with his profile picture as the header. Problems, Whitmore? A voice called out. Jeremy Prakash, once desperate for Henry's approval, leaned against a nearby column with undisguised satisfaction. Maybe try the bus? I hear they let anyone on. Henry's own words thrown back at him. The irony wasn't lost on him. When he finally reached home, he found his father in the study, surrounded by papers, looking a decade older than he had just days ago. The Carter boy, Richard began without preamble. You need to make amends. What? After what they've done to us? Richard slammed his fist on the desk. They've done nothing but expose what we've done to ourselves. Our reputation is in tatters. 3 major clients have pulled their investments today alone. So I'm supposed to beg for forgiveness because your business is suffering? You're supposed to recognize when you've been thoroughly outmaneuvered, Richard replied, his voice suddenly tired. The Carters didn't flaunt their wealth or influence. They didn't need to. That's the difference between real power and the kind we've been pretending to have. The realization settled over Henry like a shroud. His social currency had been counterfeit all along, valued only because everyone agreed to pretend it was real. That evening, Principal Montgomery called to inform them that the disciplinary committee had reached a decision. Henry was suspended for 2 weeks, with his return contingent upon completing a comprehensive ethics program. As he hung up the phone, Henry noticed his debate team trophy on the shelf, the one he'd won last year with prepared arguments and practiced delivery. Next to it sat a framed photo of him with his teammates, their smiles confident and entitled. He removed both items and placed them in a drawer, finally understanding that the identity he'd built was as hollow as the values it had been founded upon. Spring arrived at Ridgeway Academy with the tentative optimism of new growth. 4 months had passed since the Carter revelation, and the campus had undergone a remarkable transformation, not in its manicured lawns or Gothic architecture, but in the invisible currents that defined student life. The Ethics and Inclusion Committee, with Emma as its student chair, had instituted substantial changes. Scholarship students now comprise 40% of the student body rather than the previous 15%. A blind review process for club leadership positions meant that ability, not family connections, determined who led activities. Perhaps most significantly, a new mentoring program paired students from different backgrounds, creating relationships that might never have formed under the old system. Lucas, despite his revealed status, maintained his modest demeanor. He drove an unremarkable hybrid car, wore simple clothing, though Emma had noticed the quality was impeccable, and declined the private office the debate team traditionally provided its president. Henry Whitmore's return from suspension had been subdued. His 2 weeks away had stretched to a month as his father had insisted he complete a comprehensive ethics program at the Carter Foundation's headquarters, a humbling experience that involved working alongside recipients of the Foundation's charitable initiatives. On a bright Tuesday morning, Lucas found a folded note in his locker. The handwriting was immediately recognizable as Henry's, with its sharp angles and heavy pressure. Library. 3:30. Please come alone. Emma spotted the note as they walked to Advanced Economics. You're not actually going, are you? Lucas tucked it into his pocket. I am. It could be a trap. I don't think so, Lucas replied. Henry's changed. Emma remained skeptical. People like that don't change, Lucas. They just find new ways to be their old selves. Perhaps, Lucas conceded. But everyone deserves the chance to try. The library was nearly empty when Lucas arrived. Henry sat alone at a table in the rare books section, surrounded by stacks of financial records and accounting textbooks. Thank you for coming, Henry said, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by something more tentative. Lucas took the seat across from him. Your note suggested it was important. Henry pushed a folder across the table. I've been reviewing the scholarship fund's financial structure as part of my rehabilitation. There's a flaw in the distribution model. Lucas opened the folder, scanning the highlighted sections with raised eyebrows. You've done considerable research. When your father's investment firm implodes and your family's reputation collapses, you suddenly have a lot of free time. Henry replied with unexpected self-deprecation. The current system favors students from specific zip codes, creating blind spots where deserving candidates are overlooked. Lucas studied the proposal Henry had drafted. This would create more truly equitable access. It's the least I could do, Henry said, then amended. No, that's not right. It's the beginning of what I should do. For a moment either spoke. The silence between them was no longer charged with animosity, but with the awkward recognition of a relationship fundamentally altered. The all-state academic competition is next week, Lucas finally said. Henry nodded. I heard you qualified. Congratulations. The prize is $50,000. You'll win, Henry stated with certainty. Lucas closed the folder. Why are you really here, Henry? Henry looked down at his hands. I wanted to apologize. Not because my father told me to, or because it might salvage our family's social standing. He met Lucas's gaze directly. But because I was wrong. About you. About what matters. About everything. Lucas considered him thoughtfully. Apology accepted. Just like that? Holding grudges requires energy better spent elsewhere, Lucas replied. And genuine remorse deserves genuine forgiveness. The all-state academic competition transformed the school gymnasium into an intellectual battleground. Students from across the state competed in rounds of increasingly difficult questions spanning every academic discipline. The final round came down to Lucas and a brilliant girl from the state's top public magnet school. Their scores remained tied through 19 grueling questions. The final question, focused on economic theory, gave Lucas the narrow victory. As flashbulbs popped and the sizable audience applauded, Principal Montgomery handed Lucas an oversized check for $50,000. The competition had been covered by local media, and a reporter thrust a microphone toward the winner. "Mr. Carter, what will you do with the prize money?" Lucas looked out at the audience and found Emma's encouraging smile. Next to her sat his parents, who had insisted on attending. Just as proud parents, not donors. His gaze moved to the back row, where Henry stood alone, his family noticeably absent. "I'm donating it to the Ridgeway Scholarship Fund," Lucas announced. "Specifically to implement reforms recently proposed by Henry Whitmore that will ensure opportunities reach students from all backgrounds." The crowd's surprised murmur was followed by applause as Henry's expression shifted from shock to cautious hope. Afterward, as the gym emptied, Henry approached Lucas. "Why did you do that?" "Because good ideas deserve recognition, regardless of their source," Lucas replied. "And because changing broken systems requires both resources and will." Emma joined them, eyeing Henry with lingering suspicion. "I've been thinking about the mentoring program," Lucas said. "We need someone to lead the financial literacy component." Henry understood the implied offer. "I'd have to interview like everyone else, right? No special treatment?" "None whatsoever," Emma confirmed, but her tone had softened slightly. As they walked toward the parking lot, Henry noticed Lucas climbing into his modest car rather than the luxury vehicle his parents drove. "You could have any car you wanted. Why choose that one?" "Because a car is transportation, not identity," Lucas answered simply. He rolled down the window. "See you Monday, Henry. 8 a.m. sharp for debate practice." As Lucas drove away, Henry stood beside Emma in the fading light. "He doesn't flaunt it," Henry said wonderingly. "Any of it." "That's because he doesn't need to," Emma replied. "True wealth isn't what you have, Henry. It's who you are when no one's looking." Henry watched the unremarkable car disappear down the long driveway, carrying away the extraordinary young man who had dismantled his world only to offer him a better one in its place. "Money comes and goes," he murmured, repeating words Lucas had once said, "but character stays forever." For the first time, he truly understood what that meant.